Good morning. I hope you're all well. I hope you all enjoyed that Agadata. Let's learn a little bit. Erev Pesach, busy time. So here we go. We're on Nun Hey Amud Aleph, 55A1. Tan Rabbanan, it was taught. So we're on the bottom of the first column on 55A1. Tan Rabbanan was taught in Brisa, Ketzma Abram Esa Aram. How do we extend the boundaries of cities when establishing their tchum? In other words, most cities are not an exact square, right? Most cities have odd and unique shapes. And so, as we're going to see, the entire thrust of Chazal is to be lenient, to try to create the city as large as it possibly could be, and then you add the 2,000 amos, okay? So that's going to be the basis of this whole idea. And so we're always going to see that whenever we have a possibility of extending it a little bit more, we'll extend it a little bit more. So says the Gemara, so with that in mind, let's see what the Brisa says. Aruka Kamoshi, if the town is long, if it's a rectangle, we leave it as it is. There's nothing to extend. If it's a perfect rectangle, wow, that sounds amazing. Good city planning. We don't extend it. Agula osin lo zavias. If it's circular, then we make corners. We corner the circle. We square the circle, right? And therefore that adds a little bit of space, right? Because once you add the corners, that's a little more space, and then you count the 2,000 amos. Merubas ein osin lo zavias. If it's square, we do not make corners for it, which seems pretty obvious. The Gemara is going to ask, what's that all about? Let's say it's wide on one side and narrow on the other. So it's a rectangle. It's not a real rectangle. It's it starts over here and then it gets more narrow, and then it closes off. So it's if you're looking in the art scroll, it's diagram number 11. So again, it's square-ish, but it's not a perfect rectangle. Sorry, rectangular-ish. It goes starts like this, and then it gets more and more narrow. Okay, so what do you do in such a case? Rona sakilu shava. We see as if it's equal. So in other words, we add on. So wherever it's at its widest place, we add on, and we just basically may go straight from the widest place. Let's say a house protrudes like a tower, meaning if this is the top of the city and one house is over here, let's say. So what do? So you're actually going to make a line across the whole line over here. So or two houses protruding along the perimeter like two towers, which the Gemara is going to ask. Once you say for one house, why would you have to say for two houses? We'll talk about that. We take a string and we stretch it across the furthest place from the city. We take a string and we go across, so that we're adding a whole bunch of space, right? If you look at the pictures, it's diagram 12. There's two diagrams over there with one house protruding or two houses protruding, and we draw a line in both those cases. In all these cases, we measure from that place that we added 2,000 amos from that place. So let's say it was made like a bow, like a rainbow, or okimin gam, like the Greek letter gam, which is kind of like an upside down L. Okay, so you look as if that whole empty space is filled with houses and courtyards. And you measure from there 2,000 amos. Amar Mar, the Brisa said, Aruka Kamoshihi, a long city is left as it is. Pshita, that's obvious. If it's a rectangle, leave it as it is. It's a case where it is long in one direction and short in the other. Okay, so meaning it's not a square, it's actually a rectangle, which is the way I translate it. So I kind of killed the excitement over here. So Ma'adatim, I would have said, Liten la pustia ar orka. Give it boundaries whose width is equal to its length. In other words, make rectangles into squares. You may have thought that that's what you do. Kamash B'lan, no. If it's a rectangle, you leave it as a rectangle. Okay, so that's Chiddush number one. Novelty number one is rectangles stay rectangles. We don't make it into a square, which would add obviously a little bit of space. Says the Gemara further, Murbas ein osin lazavias. Quotes the Gemara. It quotes the Brisa, which said if the city is square, we do not make corners for it. Pshita, that's also obvious. So the Gemara says, it is squared, but it's not squared by the directions of the world. Murray Friedman asked this a bunch of days ago. He said, okay, how do you measure the square? Do you go by northeast, southwest, or not? And it took me a little while to understand what he was saying, but that's what he was saying. What he was saying is, let's say, you have northeast, southwest, right? But let's say the city is squared this way, right? Like on an angle. So what do? So you would think, you would you'd square to align with the directions of the world, which would mean you add a whole square on top of that diamond. Kamash, one thing where it says, no, you leave it as is. If it's a square, it's a square. We don't change it to make it squared according to the directions of the world, which will obviously add some space. Quotes the Brisa, quotes the Gemara further, quotes from the Gemara quotes the Brisa further. If the one house protrudes like a tower, then the Brisa continues, or two houses protrude like two towers. Ask the Gemara, if you already said it protrudes one house coming out of here's your city, and then right over here you have one house. The Gemara says the Brisa said you make a line across as if that house area is covered. And then said, and if it's two houses, you also do that. Of course, if it's one house and you see the whole thing as it's filled, for sure you're going to do the same thing for two houses. So the Gemara says, Lo tzricha mishnei ruchos. We're talking about a case where there's protrusion on both sides, on the both same side. We assume it's on the same side. That's what the picture drew it as. No, we're assuming one is on one side and one is on the other side. Amrinan, Kamash Malan. You would have thought maybe only you add this extra line in one direction, but if there's a house protruding on both sides, you don't do it. Kamash Malan, no, you add the line in both directions. The Brisa said if it was shaped like a bow, Okimin Gamma, game. Gam, like the letter gamma, which is like an upside down L. Ronas like and you measure, you imagine that whole empty space if it's filled with houses and courtyards, and you make it into a square, and then you measure the 2,000 amos. Rav Huna qualifies this halach. It says a city that's made like a bow. If there is, so here's your bow. Okay, that's upside down bow. Okay, up, right side up bow. Here we go. Right side up bow, right? So if there is, this is the edge 1 and this is edge 2. So if there's less than 2,000 amos from each one, meaning less than 4,000 amos together, meaning is that if we're imagining this would be its own city, and this would be its own city, and there's less than 2,000 amos from here, 2,000 amos from here, and there's 4,000 amos or less from the edges of the bow, then modin lam yeser. Then you make that the imaginary bowstring on the bottom, and you measure 2,000 amos out. Vim lav modin lam akeshes. If not, you measure from along the bow itself, meaning you measure from the top part. It's not exactly so clear from the Gemara where exactly you measure. If let's say there's more than 4,000 amos, it's a very wide bow. Okay, so rainbow. So basically, in this case, the way Tosfos understand it is that the areas that are within 4,000 amos of each other, there you square it off. But the areas which protrude, which are more than 4,000 amos away from each other, right, the edges, the sides, these parts, which are more than 4,000 amos from one another, if it's, again, a very big bow, then those would kind of stand out on their own, and you measure, they'd get their own 2,000 amos from whichever house you're in that area. But again, the area which is like over here, where it's within 2,000 amos of each, 4,000 amos of each other, there you would not. Ask the Gemara, Mir Rav Huna Hachid, Rav Huna really see this, because Rav Huna says, if a city's wall was breached, okay, and let's say you have a city wall, okay, and then there is a gap. There's a gap in the city wall of 141 and a half amos. Okay, so if there's less than 141 and a half amos, then you see it all as one. But if there's more than 141 and a half amos, then you see it as two. So here he's saying 141 and a half amos. Well, where that number comes from, we'll see, God willing, I'm going to say tomorrow, but really in 3 days when we review all 3 blot that we missed learning together in person. 3 Amudim, excuse me. But so in there, when he talks about a gap, he says the gap, it could be up to 141 and a half amos. Over here, he's saying it could be 4,000 amos. What in the world is going on? Which one is it? 4,000 or 141? That's a big discrepancy. Okay, it says like this. In the case of the city, in the case of the bow-shaped city, it's open up only on one side, right? Because you have a bow, right? So it's closed off over here, right? And then you have a gap, but the gap is really attached, right? Even though there's a big gap over here, more than 4,000 amos, but it's attached to the top, so the gap doesn't go all the way through. So therefore, it's not seen as such a gap. Really, it's in some ways a continuous place. It's just that there's a space over here, but the space is blocked off by the top of your bow. Kan mishtei ruchos. In the situation of the breached city, here you have, it used to be all one wall, but now it looks like this. So there's a big gap right over here from 2 sides. Therefore, it's a much smaller amount that you're able to have in between. If it's larger than an amount, then it's going to be seen as 2 separate cities. Ask the Gemara, what's the chiddush? What's the novelty to know something karpav lezu v'karpav lezu? So that what's the novelty of the case of the breached city that you give a karpav? That you give a karpav to each breached city that each one's going to get. 141 divided by half is 70 and a half plus whatever, 70 and whatever. It's whatever. Fine. So it's it's that measurement in between each one. In other words, what's the novelty now of that case of the breached city, that you give that space, or the space known as a karpef, in between for each city, around each city before you start measuring. Rav Huna already taught this one time. We're now on Nun Hey Amud Beis. Noticing karpef le'ir, we grant a karpef to a city before measuring its tchum. Divrei Meir, that's what Meir says. That we only give a karpef this space of 71 plus amos, 70 and a half amos or so, for a place where it's 2 cities, they're next to one another. Itzmar, and it was taught, there was explanation given about that price, about that mission. Rav Huna says, karpef lezu, each city gets its own karpef, and that equals 141 and a third amos. You only give one karpef to one of them. Bottom line is, what comes out of that whole Mishnah, I'm sorry if that was a little fast, what comes out of that whole Mishnah is that there is a debate between Rav Meir and the Chachamim as to whether or not you give before measuring the city, do you just measure from the last houses, or do you give this extra space around the city? Like a space where people are going to do their planting and things of that nature, which are really seen as included in the city. Rav Meir says, yes, you always do that. The Chachamim say, no, only when there are 2 cities, when there are two two cities next to one another, that's when you give a karpef in between them. But you normally do not give a karpef. And Rav Huda comes along and says, oh, the karpef the Chacham said between the two cities is you give a karpef for each. A karpef for each would equal 141 and a third. Okay, and there's someone who argues with him, but the point is Rav Huna says you give when you have two cities next to one another, you give 141 and a third of space, of working space in between before you start counting the 2,000 amos. And that's exactly what he's saying with the case of the breached city, the breached walls, where he says that you give 141 in between the two cities. In what way is he adding anything when he's, in what way each of these, like, what's the novelty of each of these things? They basically are saying the same thing. So the Gemara says, Tzricha, you need both of them. If you only saw in this case the breached city, we should have a late sad heter mikara. You would have said because it was initially permissible, since it wasn't initially breached, it was all one city. Therefore, you would say there you get the karpef, there you get the extra space because initially it was one city. Aval hasamim malo, but in a case with two cities which never were connected, there you wouldn't do so. V'yashmin hasamim, if you only taught in the case of two independent cities, you would have said mishum dechika tashmishtayu. Tashmishtayu, because the use of it is curtailed. In other words, you have two cities. Cities normally have space around them where you plant and you do things around the city which you cannot do inside the city, and so therefore it makes sense that you would give each city some space to work. However, but in a case where it was a one continuous city and it just got breached, it was a wall and it got breached, so you never had work that was being done in that place. Amalo. Therefore, you would say when you measure the tchum, you wouldn't have to give that extra space. You would not be allowed to give that extra space, since that city never had that extra space. Again, because it was a breached wall. That means when the city was built, there was no extra space given in between the two parts, because it was really all one continuous thing. Okay, now it broke, but we're not like taking anything away, right? Therefore, you would think, okay, in the case where it just breaches, you don't give the extra karpef space in the middle. Tzricha, therefore, you need both cases. Have a wonderful day. Have a wonderful Yom Tiv. Have a good Shabbos. Have a good Yom Tiv. It should be uplifting. It should be inspiring. We should all feel a sense of redemption. We should be able to redeem ourselves from all that is holding us back, and we'll pick up, God willing, after Yom Tiv.